Welcome, everyone, back to the Tapestry Podcast. We are your hosts, Stacy, Aguilar, and
I'm Aaron.
And this season, we're diving into a new sermon series. It's actually not new anymore because we're kind of almost done with it. Whole and Reconciled. And on today's episode, we will be fielding questions you have sent us with our returned guests, licensed therapists Hanna O and Tiff Kwong. Hi, guys.
Hello.
Hi. I just said hi, ladies. Okay, if we were to hop in your car right now, what is on your Spotify? What is going to be blasting in your car? Tiff?
Story Pirates. That is a podcast that is actually kids will write stories, submit it, and they will act it out either by song or by word. And my kids are obsessed with it, so they like to listen to stories. And it's the only way I can get peace and calm in my car is if they're listening to Story Pirates.
I don't know that one. Okay, I got to check that one out. Hanna?
Well, in my car, if Alex isn't there, I have to use Amazon Music because he uses the Spotify. We only have one account.
We run into that issue.
If the Spotify is there, we're listening to Wonka, the soundtrack for the movie, which was great. Okay. But if it's my car on Amazon Music, I'm listening to K-pop Now, which is a playlist.
Who is your favorite K-pop group?
I don't like favorites.
Okay.
I don't like having favorites in my life. But Lucy is really obsessed with New Jeans right now. So we're playing a lot of New Jeans.
Okay.
Yes. Do you know who that is, Stacey? You're looking at me.
Okay. I know. I don't know any song, but I know that that's the name of a band. Oh. How about you?
Oh, man. I actually have been doing the silence, the non-Spotify lately. I mean, this sounds like such a pastor response, but either that or just worship music. But usually it's silence these days. Oh. And that's an intentional choice. Just for me, I'm just speaking on my behalf. I think sometimes the noise of music can be like a form of like distraction or to get off of, maybe something that God might be inviting me to. Oh gosh, I sound like such a pastor. I don't intend to. I promise. It's just something for me.
We felt your genuineness.
Yeah.
I feel you. Sometimes I like the just nothing in my car. Mm-hmm. I am always listening to Taylor Swift.
That's Olive, right? Is it Olive?
It's Olive. Okay. But when it's Olive, it's only certain albums. Oh. So with It's Olive, it's a lot of Reputation. That's like our favorite album together. So we are going to be fielding questions today that people have submitted, and they have to do with the Whole and Reconciled sermon series. And so we're going to just start off right off the bat because this is a question that we saw. The theme was kind of similar, but how is therapy different from inner healing or prayer and community?
Let me preface by saying, we do recommend therapy. However, something that I share a lot is not everybody necessarily needs to do therapy. I believe that if we all had very healthy relationships in our lives, we wouldn't need to go to therapy. Mm-hmm. We would have each other to process, to be vulnerable with, to, get comfort, to get wisdom. But the reality is that we don't always have these relationships in our lives. Even if we have healthy people in our lives, we don't always have time for each other, right? Yeah. And so even when we train new gospel caregivers, something we share with them is that just the fact that you are giving 1 hour of undivided time to them a week is a gift. Mm-hmm. And we don't always get that, not even from our friends or spouses. Mm-hmm. So all that to say, what therapy can provide is different than what a church community or prayer community can provide, but it's not better or worse. It's just different. Mm-hmm. Again, in community, in a church community, you can get a lot of healing. You can get a lot of support. You can get reflection of your own woundings and areas that you need to grow in. But sometimes we don't know what those areas are yet. Yeah. So we don't have insight into how come I have these patterns in my life? How come I keep having the same issues with the same type of people? And therapy sometimes is an avenue to get further insight. Mm-hmm. We don't always know even what to pray for or what to ask healing over. And therapy can be a way to kind of know, like, hey, this is what's going on for me.
Yeah, it sounds like it's not a either or proposition.
Yeah.
Like you're saying, it's a both and. But maybe for those that are seeking and considering going to a therapist or maybe to a pastor for pastoral counseling or that kind of space where it's a little bit more focused in its care, how should somebody decide?
I guess I could take that one. I mean, I don't know that it has to be a go to one over the other. It's sort of just maybe just thinking even about like what the issue is. So like we often like to give the example of, let's say you fell and you broke your arm, right? Are you going to your pastor first and asking for prayer to heal it? Or are you going to the doctor and getting that looked at and x-rayed and doing all that sort of stuff? I think we tend to think about therapy in this I don't know, maybe it's scary or a kind of big way, but we want to sort of equate it to if you need the help in that way, is it bad to go and get the help in that specific realm and sphere while also asking for your prayer, right? Or even the example we give of like cancer, right? Like if you had cancer, would you not go and find the best doctors and treatment available,
Right.
but also be asking your church community and pastors to be praying over you for healing? Where maybe medicine is limited, that's where God can come in. And so I think, it really isn't a first who's right to go first to, but I think we need to think about, can't we seek out both?
If I could add to that a little bit, I think sometimes what we're afraid of going to tells us also what we're afraid of tapping into, maybe. So I know folks who will only go to pastors but won't seek out therapy because maybe there's something from their past or trauma that they're afraid of looking at. Or someone is intellectualizing everything and won't seek out spiritual prayer or guidance, what God thinks of it, because maybe they don't want to hear, right? They don't want to be convicted of something. So I think that takes a lot of self-reflection too. Am I purposely avoiding something because I'm afraid of what I will learn from it? So I think that's something to consider as well.
I'm wondering, if people are looking for a counselor or a therapist, is it more advantageous to receive counseling from a Christian versus a non-Christian therapist?
I feel like that really just depends on kind of what you're looking for. I think that either way, where Hanna was talking about, a lot of times therapy is most helpful just to gain insight. I do think you can get insight from a whole host of people. What you will be missing, though, or if you choose to go with someone who's not necessarily a believer, is they may not be able to speak to that aspect of your life. If it is such a huge part of who you are and how you understand and your view, your worldview, and the way that you cope with things, if that person is not a person of faith, like they're going to miss that whole side for you. So I do think you are missing out on some aspects of it. But I also am being realistic. Like it's really hard to find a Christian counselor these days who's available and maybe is affordable. And so I think if it comes down to it, sure, that's like maybe more helpful. But if you're able to find anybody that can help you gain insight, give you some tools, give you some coping skills, like that's going to be helpful no matter what.
So the next area that we're going to, we did have a whole podcast on forgiveness with Wiley Lin. However, we fielded a lot of questions about forgiveness. And something that we all noticed is that a lot of our forgiveness questions, we felt a lot of anxiety from these questions because they revolved around needing assurance about either being forgiven or how do we know if I've already really forgiven someone. So we got like different variations of all these forgiveness questions. So here's one. Why do I still feel guilty even though I have already repented of my sin and I know that God has already forgiven me? And how can we help our feelings catch up to this truth?
Yeah, I think this is a question more so about that person's concept of God rather than do we know we've been forgiven or not. What we know biblically is that God has forgiven us. You have repented, you have come before him, he has forgiven you. But if you're still battling with feelings of guilt, I think that's a question of how do I perceive my relationship with God? And then alluding to our attachment. So if I have an anxious attachment to God, even though I know the truth cognitively, I may continue to say, but do I? But do I? Can you let me know? Can you? This time, though, what about this? Is this too much for you? And so this idea of not letting the truth penetrate and kind of still sitting with our own anxiety of how we perceive God to be. So I think this is less about I need to keep praying for forgiveness, but more about how do I sit on the truths that I know about my identity, that I'm beloved, that I'm forgiven, and how do I connect with God and continually building our relationship to something that's more authentic and more secure.
So this was also a lot of questions that we kind of all combined to one. But how can I make healthy boundaries with family members or just people who have caused me trauma? And some of this trauma that people asked were like even physical or sexual, really difficult trauma, while also being loving and forgiving.
Sure. So I think there's a confusion between having forgiven someone and then saying, now this person has an open door into my life, right? So now that I've forgiven them, everything goes. You know, I can never be mad. I can never be frustrated or upset because I've already forgiven them. But I think, and Wiley alluded to this in her podcast, but there's a recognition that even though we've forgiven somebody, that person still may remain unhealthy. I have done my work to forgive and dealt with myself, but that person may not have dealt with themselves, right? Their traumas, their unhealthy patterns, their tendency to hurt, right? So if I continue to open the door and allow that person to continue hurting me, I'm not really doing very much. I may actually create new opportunities to have more trauma, forgive them again, so on and so forth. So I think maintaining boundaries to me looks more like empathy rather than accepting everything. So I can have empathy for this person and say, I think they are doing these things because of their own issues, and I could see why they can't help themselves. But it doesn't mean that that's okay or you just allow that to happen, right? So I can have empathy and not hate them or, wish them ill will, but it doesn't mean that I also then have to say, go ahead and do whatever you want, in my life.
And I think that also speaks to sort of what I talked about on the trauma podcast, which is that you also have to make sure you kind of worked through your trauma responses, right? That it's not an automatic, I am running away or I'm fighting or whatever, because that is still you operating in your trauma. And I think if you're still operating in trauma responses, then it's going to be really hard to set healthy boundaries, right? Because that's going to be just your way of protecting. I think boundaries are very much about, I know who I am, I know who that person is, and we have our separate spaces. And when you encroach into my space, I can hold that, right? I can hold not seeing you. I can hold limiting my contact with you, not allowing you to continue to hurt me. But I do think that if you don't address that trauma, if you don't work on that first, it is really hard to then move towards forgiveness. And then from there, move towards setting healthy boundaries. So I think it all has to be kind of in place or lined up before you can have a healthy boundary place. Because I feel like I see a lot of people who will say, oh yeah, I've forgiven them, or I've moved past, this, and I'm just completely cutting them out of my life, which to me sometimes still screams, is it a trauma? Like run, flee, don't even engage with them. But I feel like that really breaks that side of like God's desire for us to be in relationship, right? To be in reconciled relationships. And that's hard if you're still operating in that trauma response.
That's really helpful. And I feel like the distinction that both of you are getting at is if you're operating reactively, which Tiff, you're using like the language of trauma, triggers, that's like something that's not a decisive response, something that a person is deciding to do. Or Hanna, what you were alluding to, like even maintaining boundaries can be an act of love itself. Because not only is it protecting you, it's protecting the other person. And so you can hold that tension. You can forgive that person and still act and respond lovingly through these forms of establishing boundaries. And it's kind of more of a thoughtful response than it is a reaction from a trigger or trauma.
Right. Yeah, right.
Kind of connected to that. And this is a question that I think has been alluded to, whether in a couple weeks ago in the sermon with Hanna's sermon or in Wiley's forgiveness podcast too. But what's the difference between forgiveness and reconciliation?
Yeah, I could take that. I mean, I agree. I think that Hanna beautifully laid that out in the sermon a couple weeks ago. Remember, she gave that whole list of like what forgiveness is and what it's not, right? It is like our choice to kind of let these things go. It does not make whatever the offense was okay. It doesn't make, we're talking just about justice and all of that. I think forgiveness is really this idea of I am choosing to let go of whatever the offense is. I'm not saying it's okay, but I'm releasing that, right, to the foot of the cross and saying, I don't want this to control me anymore. The emotions and all that connects to, it's very much in my mind like a one-way street, right? So I can choose to forgive that person. But, Hanna talked about like, what if there is forgiveness and then there is the repentance. So there's the part of the offender who says the I'm sorry or the, contrition that kind of comes with that. What if you don't get that, right? Like what if someone has passed away or what if I'm no longer in contact because that's how I can stay healthy? What if I don't get that feedback in response? I think that's where we see the difference between like reconciliation. Reconciliation is the piece of adding in the forgiveness, then the actual repentance, and the reconciliation is kind of the making the whole. But we don't always get that, unfortunately. That's not always on our side of heaven. We're going to get that full piece. So I don't think you have to be at reconciliation in order for forgiveness to exist, right? Forgiveness can exist. That's your choice. Whether that other person comes and is able to be reconciled to me is really up to God, right? That's the part you have to let go of. And that's where the forgiveness, I think, can come in for your own freedom.
And that kind of alludes to that part of the question where it's just like, even if people are not willing to change, that doesn't matter because you can still make that decision to forgive. Because I think that was a lot of the question. Like, what if my spouse refuses to change or my in-laws are not going to change? Do I still have to forgive them? And the answer we would say is
Yes. Yes.
yes, absolutely. Pastor Aaron, how would you as a pastor counsel someone who is upset or feeling angry with God?
Yeah, that is, I think, a very complicated area because depending on where the person is coming from, because perhaps the person is coming from maybe they feel like they have a bent towards they can't feel those emotions. Like it's wrong for them to feel anger. That's like a negative emotion that they can't get in touch with. But then maybe it leaks out. They have like this kind of frustration or a sense of lack of trust with God. If anything, if I have one encouragement for people in these really complex emotions is to just show up with God, with those emotions, honestly, and allow Him to hold you there in that space. And also hold the tension of like the truth of what God's word says. Because I think that's a lot of the movement you see within the Psalms too. It's the psalmist often expressing the rawness and the honesty of their emotions, but then going to and arriving to a place, yet God, I can still hope in you. Yet you are still my shield and my comfort and my rock. And they have these movements where they're arriving to those places, holding the rawness and honesty of their emotions and the truth of who He is.
I'll also just say, even when you were saying like negative emotions and, like I think even the language that we as a culture put on that, it's so many of us were taught anger is not okay. Like it's not okay to be angry. And I think about how many of us have that lens of, well, what did I experience or how did I see anger playing itself out behaviorally, right? Growing up, was this a very angry parent who lashed out and just acted inappropriately? And so when we think about, is it okay for me to behave that way towards God, right? Our King. We have this reaction of like, that can't be okay. That's culturally, not okay to say that. But I feel like He understands the emotion, right? He lived it, He experienced it. And you're talking about all these examples scripturally where it was, He felt it, but He didn't necessarily respond in that way. So I think when I hear this question, it also makes me think of when you think about being angry at God. Like, what else does that invoke in you? Maybe a picture of somebody else or your example or your parenting or whatever of like, what did anger look like? Because again, like you're talking with your kids, it's okay to be angry, but then how it's expressed is where we're often not taught that in a healthy way. So even thinking about how can we bring our anger to God, but not experience it or at least behaviorally experience it like in a very negative way that we all kind of see it in our minds.
And I will say, I think our ability to show our emotions to another person does reflect our level of closeness with them. Like if we have a relationship with somebody and we can only show happiness or, when we're feeling good, then that does show a level of relationship that's more shallow, right? But if we have a different type of relationship where we can be frustrated with them or resentful of them or jealous of them, I think it does show like, I can be this vulnerable with you and we are that close that I can do that and I feel safe to do that. My son the other day was really mad at me and then told me after I pried it out of him, he said, I can't believe you as an adult would take that book from me or something like that. And was like weeping. And even though he was directly mad at me, I was the culprit. I was the wrong person in this scenario. I was so happy that he felt like he could tell me that he was mad at me and that I did something wrong. And that everyone rallied around him because his grandparents were there. It's like, you're right. Your mom was the problem. I don't know why she did all that. But needless to say, I could tell that he trusted me to be able to share that emotion. So I think even though we're using examples like anger, but I think for those who are listening to think about, hey, are there certain emotions that I feel like I can't bring to the Lord? I can only bring good ones. Or I can only bring it to them when I've already thought it out and it's already nicely pieced together. Or can I bring the raw, unfiltered emotions?
Yeah, and I think even like, where will you be doing that? Where will you be revealing your angry and upset at God? Well, in prayer, right? And those are like very intimate moments that you spend with God. So you can't be in that, like you said, that intimate space with the Lord where you can be angry if you're not spending that time in prayer. And that leads to the both and.
Yeah.
The therapy or getting counsel from pastors and people. But it also means like you need to be spending time with God. One of my favorite parts in scripture in 1 Kings is like when Elijah is like so angry, 1 Kings 19, and he's like so mad at God. And then God's like, just why don't you take a nap, like sleep under this tree, and then like, are you hungry? Eat some food, because like that's like what we are with as parents, right? Like when our kids are throwing tantrums, I'm like, oop, it's bedtime, or he missed his nap, or he must be hungry. And I love that picture of like, that is God as our father being like, oh, you're really mad? That's fine. Do you need sleep? Like, are you hungry right now? And that God can handle all of that as like the perfect father. Okay, we also want to lead into some mental illness questions. And it's interesting because I feel like a lot of these questions are creating these false dichotomies, like culturally. I don't know where it comes from. Maybe it has to do with our Asian Americanness. I'm not sure. But what does that look like for God to heal mental illness? And can he?
The short answer is, of course. He can heal anything. He can heal physical illness and mental illness. I think the problems we will run into is if we feel like that is the only way that God can heal mental illness is through prayer or, laying of hands. I think, like you mentioned, Stacy, we don't want to discount how God works. And just like God can use medical doctors to heal your physical ailments, but he can also heal you miraculously. He could do the same for mental illnesses as well. But I do think that he also equipped in his grace and mercy, right, many providers with the ability to manage mental illness or tackle mental illness through other means as well. So I think, again, we just want to shy away from just the idea of it has to be one or the other, but why not both, right? Get the help that you need in the ways that he has provided in like the medical field, but then also through prayer and healing as well.
And I think just even the language of mental health versus mental illness, right? Like we need to be able to be clear that there is this idea of you can actually be mentally healthy, and that is to be in connection to, have right relationship with each other where I can express all my emotion and it's contained within a safe space and I'm, received and accepted and loved. Like that is a healthy space to be mentally, but there's equally the illness, right? Where things do go wrong for a variety of reasons. And whatever it is, it's difficult for us to be able to adapt or to deal with whatever it is. And that's where the illness comes in, right? I mean, I think about even from a physiological perspective, illness is like some part of our body that is not responding the way that it's supposed to, right? So a diabetic, like they're not creating the insulin in their body. And so we fix it by introducing the insulin. But like, I think even in our minds, it's the same thing. If there are areas that can go wrong, our negative thoughts, the lies take over, and then depression hits, right? And so it's an illness that with the right treatment and even surrendering, right, it can be healed. I think we just have to see it in this, like, it's so taboo in our culture to think that, oh, mental health means you're crazy, right? Mental illness means you're crazy. And I think we need to move away from that there is space for us to be resilient and to move through that and to heal.
So this kind of leads, it's like an addition to that first question, but how do you diagnose mental illnesses like schizophrenia from, what culturally and historically they thought was demonic possession, right? Or even now, sometimes we see it as oppressions and attacks, spiritual attacks. How would you be able to say, like, this is psychological or spiritual?
I think that it could be both, right? So we have to look at, research is very clear that there are genetic predispositions to a lot of mental illnesses, right? So meaning if a family member has schizophrenia, you are, a certain percentage more likely just genetically to have the same thing. But you factor that in with nurture, so environment, right? So stressors, oftentimes a lot of mental illnesses actually come out early in at like kind of adolescent, young adult age. And I think that's not it's not a coincidence, because I feel like that's really when you're wrestling through a lot of emotions, trauma, stress, right? Like that's a time you're kind of figuring yourself out. And I feel like it's that combination. So you have genes, you know, what happens in your society. And then let's just be honest, we are fighting in a world where there is spiritual battle, right? So I think there is the combination of all of these things that can lead to certain mental illnesses that do exist. But when I think about this, because we do get asked that a lot, like, how do I know that this isn't just something that I need to pray away, right? Or they need to be, you know, cast out or whatnot. A few years ago, Tapestry, we went through a sermon series through Soul Care, which was Rob Reimer's book. And he actually came and gave like a deliverance talk to a lot of the leaders. And one of the things that he said that was really helpful for me to just frame was, in a lot of life, there are going to be things that are just human, right? So trauma, things that are going to happen to us that are going to cause certain, you know, illnesses in our life or mental illness. But there are also realistically evil spirits and forces at hand that we are battling every single day. And I think that sometimes it can be both. And in treatment, it is, you need to go to the human treatment to kind of work through the human stuff, but what is spiritual can only be fought in a spiritual space, right? And so you can only cast out what is demonic, but you can still be left with fractured minds, fractured bodies, fractured relationships as a result of that. And we have to work through those in a human perspective, which might be a therapy or being in community and sharing that of ourselves.
It's funny because when you were sharing, like, oh, schizophrenia, for example, could be genetic, right? But that's the genetic predispositions, but that's also physical. Right? Like same thing with diabetes. Like that can also have
High cholesterol.
Right. And you, again, do whatever you can to prepare physically, but also there are all these other aspects of like making choices, but also going to pray and being making healthy spiritual choices as well. And we don't frown upon that or think that's weird, but there is this weird stigma that we do feel towards mental illness.
I think that goes the same way with even taking care of ourselves. You know, I think there's a tendency to like, you know, everything from the neck down, right, is physical, right? You know, pain, aches. So you treat that with whatever exercise, or you could go get medication, and no one thinks that's weird, right? But everything from the neck up that, you know, maybe is like our thoughts, emotions, brains, you know, schizophrenia, a lot of the things, maybe genetics within our brain is like in our heads, right? Or it's demonic. Or so again, there's this tendency to split even parts of our being into one being more physical, tangible, and one being just this like ethereal, unknown, you know? But I think in that way, we also then ignore ways to take care of ourselves, right? We can take care of ourselves physically, but also in our mental health as well, spiritually as well. And I think we neglect to do those things because we think of it as this nebulous, unknown thing that we don't know how to manage. Period. Didn't know how to.
Well, but let me just speak to, I think when you're talking about how do we care for ourselves, right? So again, people do ask me, like, how do I stay mentally healthy?
Yes.
Right.
So much of that is community, right? Where when we talk about in week 5, it's about community. It's about when I'm in my moments of depression, or even if I'm very anxious about something, I really need to be bringing it out to other people because that is where it is restored. That is where the lies are spoken into. And that's really where you maintain the health. Like even when I would work with women who are struggling with postpartum depression, one of the biggest things that I tell people is you just need to get outside, get some sun, and see other people, because you are so locked into this world of being a pumping cow, right? Like there's just nothing else about you. And who wouldn't be depressed by that? And so one of the things is get into God's nature. Go out with other people, talk to them.
Come out to church.
Yes, and community. And in community, the things that can go wrong, the illnesses tend to go at least a little bit more at bay. It's what we call as preventative, right? We need to be preventative in the way that I know I'm going to struggle, or I'm in a season of struggling. I need to be out there so that I don't fall deeper into that struggle or deeper into that depression.
Yeah, one of you shared in our pre-interview about how, like, if we were going into our community, that some of our mental illness, I forget the exact quote.
Like if we had healthy relationships, we wouldn't be struggling with some of these mental illnesses. I mean, I think about even someone in therapy, they could be benefiting and progressing and growing. But what I share with clients all the time is this is 1 hour of your week, right? What are you going to do for the rest of the hours of your week? How are you going to practice these things? How are you going to continue to be vulnerable? Who else are you going to share it with? Because I say this, I may be good, but I'm not that good, you know? Like this might be helpful, but you have to figure out a way to continue this. And you have to find people to continue this with. Then because your progress will only go so far, you know? And that's why I say, community like Tapestry can do so much for someone who is struggling. They may be going to therapy, as they should. But outside of that, we can also be providing other ways of support to reinforce the truths that they're now having insight about. So that it doesn't just end with that 1 hour.
And I think even like one of the things I think I hear so often from both clients and even in gospel care is this idea of, well, you're like the first person I've ever told this to. And to me, that's a problem. If I, as a paid professional, I'm the first person you're telling about your depression, like, I think that's one of the beautiful parts about Tapestry is that we are a church that is choosing to look at the ugly, right? Look under the hood and say, it is okay to bring all of this stuff that you're feeling and share it. And I guess my challenge to our church is like, it doesn't have to just be therapy, right? Like, I think we don't want that to be the blanket fix all. Like, I don't think that it's for everybody, what Hanna was saying. I think if we honestly, authentically brought our stuff in the context of community, and it was a community that showed up for each other and supported each other and just wrestled, right? We don't have to have the answers, but wrestled through it genuinely in prayer and in support. Like, I don't think a lot of us would need to necessarily be in therapy. I think we would be able to resolve a lot of that just on its own, and just through that community, that restorative process of community.
And one of the things I do love about Tapestry, I went out to dinner, 2 moms took me out to dinner for my birthday, and we were talking about how trauma bonded us, especially this group of moms, our friends, and how it was like during these moments of trauma, we became really close because this is where we were not that close before this traumatic event happened, but this is like where we really showed up for each other. And here's a prayer chain. Who can drop off food? Who can pick up their kids? Remember? And that's when a lot of our friendships were formed. And even as I was reflecting about Sharon and Seyoung, their friendship was born out of trauma, right? And it was this idea of like, trauma does not define us, and God can do such beautiful things with the hardest parts of our lives. And one of these beautiful things is building community. And that is something that we want to really encourage people here at Tapestry is you will not magically create community. And we at Tapestry can provide spaces, but it will not magically happen. You do have to do the hard work in coming out to cell group on a consistent basis, going and reaching out. Today I got an email about spaces, and I love that, like being able to be proactive. And when are you guys offering your next spaces? I would love to be a part of this group. And being proactive about using the prayer room, because again, the both and. Plug into community, but also come and pray. Come to him in your anger. He will hold that space for you. As well as if you want to seek therapy, go for it. Seek therapy. We want a holistic healing for everyone because that's how God has it planned.
Yes to all. It's just yes to all. If I could just add anything, it would just be just being intentional. And I know like it could feel really overwhelming if you're in a place where you're really struggling in your mental or emotional health, and perhaps you feel isolated or you don't even know where to go or where to begin. That can feel overwhelming. But I think if you can identify small, actionable steps that can help you move towards connection, because that's the goal. If there's a true north, it is to help foster, whatever helps foster meaningful and deep connection with God, first and foremost, and with others in a healthy and safe way. And if I have a takeaway from this conversation, it is like relationships is what it comes down to. One way you could summarize the teachings of Jesus and the way of Jesus is loving God and loving others, right? And so that's assumed relationships. It's the art of doing relationships well and healthily and meaningfully. And one thing that I found helpful, and if friendships are something that's challenging for you, you don't really know how to even navigate through or how to start friendships or form, C.S. Lewis, and I think the way he put it is that friendship starts with that, oh, you too moment. It's a moment where you share like a common interest, a common love, a common way of thinking about something, a common like experience. And of course, that's just a start. But for believers, I think the beautiful thing is even if you like have nothing in common with each other, you're different life stages, you live at different parts of the city, you don't have any of the same interests, there is a common love for Jesus. And that's always a starting point. And us as a community striving to pursue Jesus and love Jesus and share our love for Jesus together. And then the other stuff come into place, right? Like, you know, if you love pickleball, yeah, do pickleball together. If you love like the Dodgers like me, like I share that interest with some of my friends that also love the Dodgers or whatever. But baseline at least is just leaning into your love for Jesus and sharing that with community.
Yeah. So if you're looking for what to do next, we've got connection groups. We've got Restoration Center. Please reach out for gospel care. We have a couple who met at Tapestry's Pickleball Ministry, and now they're getting married.
Wow.
So start
Wow.
at something similar.
Start somewhere.
Start somewhere.
Yep.
Simple as pickleball, even though I was trying to get rid of all of our sports ministry events. I
dare
know.
you?
I know. I just was like, let's just go straight to Jesus. But anyway, I'm like, oh, pickleball.
Jesus is there.
Jesus is at pickleball, y'all. Anyway, so thank you guys for joining, and we'll see you next week.